Well, welcome. Good evening. Good to have you with us tonight. Happy you made it out. This is our middle night. We opened up last night with Pastor Emil Schmidt. As I was telling him, he is the Alpha and the Omega. He had our opening session on Wednesday night, and he will have our closing session on Sunday at 11 o'clock. That is Lord willing and rapture pending, of course. So looking forward to those things. Had 4 good sessions today. Appreciate the morning speakers, the afternoon speakers. Well, now we come to the evening time and our keynote address, our prime time message coming from Dr. Titus Kennedy. And again, how many good things can I say about Titus? And it's not fair. I tell you, I have 4 of my own pastor's kids, and I know that it's rough when you're a pastor's kid. And I know that it's not fair to always introduce Titus as the son of Pastor Todd Kennedy, but that's how I met him way back in the day. And what was really fun, and I think high school or junior high maybe was the first time I met you, but what was really fun though was spending time with Titus in Kiev, Ukraine. And I had a chance in Ukraine. He was teaching Greek and Hebrew. He was working with Jim Myers in the Bible college there, and that was fun. That was absolutely fun because I got to have one-on-one time and got to spend time with Titus there, and we've been very blessed ever since. We actually hosted Titus once upon a time, very early in this building. We built this building in 2010, and one of the first things we did when we were in the new property was we brought Titus in for an archaeology conference, and it was so successful and wonderful and spectacular that we couldn't talk about it. Actually, we had to keep everything off the website and very private, and you remember that? You asked us to not, yeah, okay. And part of the difficulty he was having, and what you do in the world of archaeology, if they suspect that you're born again and you believe the Bible and you believe that the things the Bible says are true, then that may have repercussions in the world of academics. Well, thankfully, Titus is done with all that, and the mask is off, and he's got books, he's got YouTube videos, he's got, you'll find him all over the place if you just search his name on YouTube. So, in fact, there was one just last week I saw with Henry Smith, and is that right? You sat down with Henry? Yeah, that was a good one. I like Henry. We got to meet Henry at Schaefer last year, so that was a blessing also. Anyway, I'm rambling now. Titus, please come forward and bring us your message.
Thank you, Bob. Well, good evening. Tonight, we're going to look at biblical archaeology. And when people ask me about biblical archaeology, what's the use of it? How can it be helpful when we are studying the Bible, or how is it helpful in the context of our Christian faith? And I want to start by just overviewing 3 primary uses of it, and then give some examples and go into our main topic tonight. But the first would be to illuminate the ancient historical context of Scripture. Obviously, the Bible was written long ago in a land far away, in languages that most of us don't speak. Maybe there are some people here that do speak Greek or Hebrew, probably not the ancient variations. But this can be helpful for our own study, for interpretation. We'll look at some examples of that. We also have the use of demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible, the truth of Scripture from the hard facts that are discovered in the ground. And this can be encouraging to those who are Christians, or maybe those who are having some questions about the factual basis of the faith, but also to those who are seeking. And then the third thing that archaeology has done, although this is less often, is to also find ancient manuscripts of the Bible. And a few passages that I relate to these 3 categories are 2 Timothy 2:15, which tells us to rightly divide the word. And one of the tools in doing that is understanding the context in which the various books of the Bible were written. Their authors, their language, their city, their geopolitical context, and so forth. Second category, 1 Peter 3:15 is always a favorite verse, sort of the apologetics verse, in fact, where we get this term, because Peter tells us to always be ready to make a defense for what we believe, for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And in his second epistle, he gives a little bit more specific text about this when he discusses how the stories, so to speak, the records about Jesus in the Gospels were not myths, but he and others were eyewitnesses. And then finally, with the manuscripts, yet again, Peter here, he tells us that the word of the Lord stands forever. And we can see this through the manuscripts as we study those. So first, to get to the manuscripts, one set of manuscripts that was discovered partially by archaeologists and partially by accident was the Dead Sea Scrolls. And many of you are probably very familiar with these. But they were discovered around 1946. There are a couple variations on the story, but by Bedouin shepherds near the Dead Sea. And they didn't know exactly what they had when they found them. They just knew it was old and they could sell them and these were valuable. And so that's what they tried to do. They actually divided some of these scrolls up because they thought they could get more money out of it that way. But when some scholars noticed these and found out the general area where they were from, they launched some expeditions and began excavating more of the caves, finding more and more of these scrolls in jars, sealed at the back of caves by bat dung. And one of the most incredible of all these texts is the Great Isaiah Scroll, complete copy of the book of Isaiah. It's from about 330 BC, and we do have a few other Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts from about the 4th century BC. So when you take into account the difference in years between what our previous Hebrew manuscripts were from the 900s, from about 1000 AD, we're looking at 1200, 1300 year difference. And yet, as textual scholars looked over those, they saw we have the same text today. Few variants here and there, maybe some information about which variant was the original, but it showed the extremely careful copying tradition of those scribes and how they treated that with the utmost respect because they regarded it as the Word of God. Every single letter needed to be right, and that is the case that we see from examples such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, the New Testament has a slightly similar story. One great example of this comes from Egypt, the Oxyrhynchos papyri. These were excavated in a rubbish dump in a city of Egypt, and they had to piece together a lot of these, but among the many, many texts were some very important New Testament manuscripts. Just one great example, we've got P90 is the designation, Papyrus 90, for the Gospel of John from the 2nd century and also a 2nd century fragment of Matthew. And by the way, in Old Testament texts, actually our oldest existing manuscript of Esther also came from this excavation. So that's one way that archaeology can help us with the manuscripts, the actual words of the Bible, and getting back to those early copies. But what about interpretation? One appropriate example comes from 1 Samuel 13:21. Now, if you read this verse in translations prior to 1917, it will not have one of the words translated correctly because no one knew what this word was for millennia. It's this Hebrew word pim, but in excavations at the site of Gezer in the early 20th century, they came upon this stone weight, and it was inscribed in Paleo-Hebrew with the word pim. They put it on a scale. They found that it was 2/3 of a shekel. You've heard of shekels before, very standard measurement tool for the ancient Israelites and others. And so then they found out, oh, this is the cost in silver that it was to sharpen some of these implements so that they could go out and then fight. But something else interesting about this discovery is that it shows that Samuel was written in this early monarchy period because this weight went out of use. And that's why it was forgotten about. In fact, if you look at the Septuagint translators also in the 3rd century BC did not know exactly what this was. So that's one example of helping us with our interpretation, our translation. The third category would be historical corroboration or reliability. And the story of David is an excellent example. In the 1980s and then into the early 1990s, David was regarded as a mythological king by the vast majority of archaeologists, ancient historians, and even many biblical scholars. And the reason was that they had no archaeological evidence for his existence. Of course, we had the Bible, but most of those scholars discounted the Bible as a reliable historical source. The idea was the Bible is guilty until proven innocent with very clear archaeological evidence. But in 1993, excavations at Dan in northern Israel uncovered, as part of an area of a plaza in front of the city gate, a reused stone. This stone had once been part of a victory stele, a victory monument of the neighboring Arameans. And when the Israelites had retaken the city, they had smashed this victory monument. So initially, one large piece, the one with the white highlighted there, was found. And this was actually the most important piece because it talked about two of these kings, one of Israel, Joram, and one of Judah, Jehoram. And it said that he was of the house of David. And so suddenly, we had archaeological evidence from the 9th century BC, from an enemy of Israel, no less, acknowledging that David was the founding king of the Israelite dynasty. And after that, so many scholars immediately almost changed their position on the idea of David as a historical figure. There were a few who said, oh, that was forgery, you planted it. But in subsequent years of excavation, they actually found more pieces of the stele. So you see some more of those pieces there. Some others wanted to translate it differently, interpret it differently, but the context is crystal clear as it's talking about a battle between the Arameans and the Israelites. It mentions a king of Israel. It means a king of Judah. We know that it's talking about David. It's not a place. It's not some other name. And so nearly all scholars accept this as evidence for David. And since then, more has been found. Another inscription was reevaluated. His palace was discovered. Work was done on numerous sites within his kingdom, demonstrating that he was not just a tribal leader in Jerusalem, but he was a king in the way that the Bible records him and his rule. Finally, the Bible also helps us to locate archaeological sites. So this is sort of going the other direction, helping us locate it, and then we find it, and then it corroborates or illuminates the text. And a recent site that I have been working on is Zoar. You see this map here. That's called the Madaba map. It was made around 542 AD. And it's a map of the Holy Land during the Byzantine period. And so they marked all these important biblical sites. Zoar is there on the southeastern side of the Dead Sea. But of course, it didn't give us GPS coordinates. So it took some other archaeological work to find. And now that is in process. But one reason I point this out is to show that there is continuing work and more is being discovered. And there's a lot to be discovered. In fact, other finds from just this year that you may have heard of or may not have, depending on how closely you look at the news, but in Jerusalem, they found a small Assyrian cuneiform tablet that seems to talk about the tributes going from Hezekiah to the Assyrians in about 700 BC. They also found another fortress along what the Bible calls the Way of the Philistines, where the Israelites were instructed to not go lest they see war. And there are all sorts of Egyptian military forts along that way, new one discovered. And then finally, Colossae The excavations there just began late this year. And even though it's quite an important New Testament site, and a lot of schools, universities wanted to work on it, it had never been done before. So they started on the necropolis, or the cemetery. So that gives us a brief overview. But I want to get into one particular example that I think especially emphasizes illumination and historical reliability, and that is looking at the Pharaoh of the Exodus. If you were here years ago when I taught on biblical archaeology, we went through some material on the Exodus. Some of it might have been discussed, others you may have read about, but I think there will be some new material tonight. So first of all, what is the view about the Exodus and also who the Pharaoh might have been? Well, if we look in academia, the typical view is that the Exodus did not happen. So William Deaver, for example, says that there's no archaeological evidence for such an Exodus. I regard the historicity of the Exodus as a dead issue. Hadn't found anything. We know it didn't happen. Zev Herzog, Israeli archaeologist, he says the Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander in the desert. The many Egyptian documents that we have make no mention of the Israelites' presence in Egypt and are also silent about the events of the Exodus. Some would say that there is a jumbled memory or use of some events in Egyptian history that were brought into the Torah. So one view is that Necho II, who reigned very late in the 7th century BC, so near the end of the time of the kingdom of Judah, that things in his reign influence the Exodus myth. So this is typically what you would read if you're looking through scholars and their opinions on the Exodus. But what about if it was historical? Well, the main problem is that Moses did not give us the name of the Pharaoh. So what does he say? Exodus 12:51, he says, "And on that same day the Lord brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts." And then in Exodus 14:8, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel, as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. So they exited Egypt, the Pharaoh chased them, but who was this? And there have been many, many theories, ideas about who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was in Egyptian history or Egyptian sources. I listed quite a few of them. There are actually more than this, but Dedumos II, this is the new chronology view. He was from the 16th dynasty, but Manetho says that he actually subdued Egypt. It was an invasion. Thutmose III used to be quite popular because he died around 1450 BC, and we'll look at the date of the Exodus. It's close to that. Amenhotep II was his son. He reigned during 1446 BC, and this has become a more prominent candidate or selection. Thutmose IV, there are a couple of people who argue for this, partially on basis that they take a Septuagint chronological variant and also have their own chronological scheme of things. Akhenaten, some have proposed this. He's the one who changed the religious system of Egypt to Atonism, which was not monotheism. It's called henotheism. It's elevating one god above the rest. Ramses II is popular in movies, and that is because of some early 20th century archaeologists especially. And then Merneptah was one of his sons, the son that ruled after him. And one reason for him being identified is that Ramses had a very long reign, and because on a stele of Merneptah, he actually mentions Israel in Canaan. But there are many, many problems with all but one of these. Let's start, though, with the chronology of the Exodus. Our primary passage is 1 Kings 6:1, and it tells us in the 480th year after the Israelites came up out of Egypt, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign over Israel, and then he began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. We know Solomon's reign. We know the dates for those. I won't get into it, but there are synchronisms between the king lists of Israel and Judah and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians, Greeks, Romans, all the way down. So a full elapsed 479 years added to the fourth year of his reign would place the Exodus from Egypt in approximately 1446 BC. Maybe a year off, but right around there. Now, why might we take this as a real number of solar years? Well, one reason, we look in Numbers 33, we look in passages like Deuteronomy 1:3, and it shows that the Israelites began to number their years in a sort of era system, starting with the exit from Egypt. We also see in Judges 11:26 that Jephthah is talking about how the Israelites have been in the land for about 300 years. And he was a judge in about 1100 BC. So we just do some addition of 300, 40 of wandering. We get into the 1440s BC once again. There's an interesting genealogical passage in 1 Chronicles 6 that gives us 19 total generations from the Exodus to Solomon. And if we average out generations at about 25 years, then we get 475 years, so very close as well. And you can even do this by adding together all the other years recorded in various books, whether it's Kings, Judges, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, and so forth. Just you have to account for the fact that at the end of the Judges period, there were judges ruling at the same time, overlapping. So all of that gets us to 1446 BC. Now, the objection to this primarily is that some scholars take 1 Kings 6:1 as symbolic. So here's another place where archaeology can help us a little bit with this. The claim is that in the ancient Near East, temple dedication texts that had these big, long numbers of years were symbolic for just a long period of time, or the numbers themselves meant something, but they didn't give us real data. But this is actually not the case. And if you look through a study on these temple dedications from the ancient Near East, and I wrote an article on this recently, you will see that they actually all are trying to give us a real chronology, and they are right on or extremely close. There's only one case where one of 3 dates by a Babylonian king is off because it was something so far in the past he just didn't know and he had to guess. 40 is also talked about in the same way. 40 is in the Bible all the time. It just means a generation, or it's a ambiguous medium period of time. And the appeal is typically to this inscription called the Mesha stele, because Mesha, king of Moab, says that Omri took the land of Madaba and occupied it in his day and in the days of his son 40 years. And they claim that this was not a 40-year period. But all we have to do is look at the biblical king list, and we see that it was. Omri was the one who took over Moab. He had a 12-year reign, followed by Ahab, 22-year reign, Ahaziah, 2 years. And then in the reign of Jehoram is when they rebelled and regained. So it's either 40 years or it's off by a year or something, but it's approximately 40 years. He's trying to give us an actual number there. So we take that 480th year as a real number. We get to 1446 BC. Now, what about in Egyptian history? What about in the archaeology of Canaan? One example from each of those. There's an inscription, actually 2 inscriptions, on a temple in what is now Sudan, and they mention the nomads of Yahweh. So the Pharaoh, Amenhotep III, actually mentioned the Israelites during the wandering period. And he is a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, conventionally would be dated around 1400 BC. Now, there are 2 differing chronologies for this period of Egypt, but it's only about 25 years maximum difference. I'm taking what's called the high chronology, and I can't get into the reasons for that, but We'll just see how the patterns fit. So 18th dynasty wandering seems to connect to the date of the Exodus and the wandering according to the Bible, and place the Exodus in the 18th dynasty. After this, we see the conquest of Canaan, and we have destructions at sites like Jericho, Ai, Hatzor. No destruction at Shechem, which is important if you read Joshua very closely. And these all happen around 1400 BC in conventional archaeological chronology, which we would call late Bronze Age 1, also the 18th dynasty of Egypt. And yet again, we have an association here with Amenhotep III, because we have scarabs of his that turn up at Jericho and at Hatzor, and we have a letter written to him about this king of Shechem giving his land to the Habiru. So that also seems to give us the sequence that we're looking at, 1446, 18th dynasty. So let's shift back then to the Pharaoh himself. Well, it's not odd that Moses didn't use the name of the Pharaoh. It seems to be a convention of the time to not name your enemy in certain situations. It wouldn't give him the respect of that. But we also see the term Pharaoh coming into use in the 18th dynasty. So probably then not going to be earlier than that if Moses is writing this right after the time of the Exodus. But there are some very important qualifications in the Exodus narrative about the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh just prior to the Exodus. First of all, we know that the pre-Exodus Pharaoh must have reigned at least 40 years. We know this because Moses kills the Egyptian in chapter 2. He flees to the wilderness. He is there for 40 years, according to the book of Acts. And then God tells him, the king has died, and the men seeking your life are dead. You can go back. So he goes back. That Pharaoh's gone. 40 years, though. It's a long time, right? Well, there are only a few pharaohs in all of Egyptian history who ruled 40 or more years. And in the 18th dynasty, there's only one. That is Thutmose III. He ruled for about 54 years. We also see that the Exodus Pharaoh has come into power fairly recently because Moses hears about the death of the previous Pharaoh. He goes back to Egypt. How long did it take him to get there? How long did he discuss with the Pharaoh and all the plagues? We don't know. It wasn't decades. It probably wasn't days or just a few weeks either. So, it may have been a couple of years until the Exodus finally occurred. But a Pharaoh who comes into power fairly recently. So, Amenhotep II, the son of Thutmose III, who reigned for more than 40 years, comes into power around 1450 BC, just before the Exodus. But this family is very intriguing. If you recall, earlier in the book of Exodus, Moses is rescued from the Nile by the daughter of Pharaoh, and then she adopts him into the house. He's raised in the school of the Egyptians, learns Egyptian and probably how to read and write Egyptian as well. So who was this, and can this help us to understand the rest of the context of the story? Well, if we look at this period, we match up the chronologies, there is someone who appears to be the daughter of Pharaoh, and that would be Hatshepsut. She was the only child of the Pharaoh Thutmose I and his queen named Ahmose that survived past infancy. So he then married another queen to have more children. One of those children was Thutmose II. Hatshepsut married this guy. And to make a long story short, she was the only candidate around the time when Moses was born. And so even though she would have been a young girl, she asked her servant to go save him, and then she adopted this child. Now, fast forward to many, many years later, something even more odd here. Amenhotep II, I mentioned him, he's the son of Thutmose III. He was the Pharaoh who we think was there at the time of the Exodus. He never had met Hatshepsut. He was born at least a decade after her death, probably. And yet he retaliated against her monuments. We see many, many cases of this. I will just give you a few examples. To the right, you see this picture, two Egyptian deities, and in the middle, that was Hatshepsut. Her image was cut out. On the left, you see a statue of Hatshepsut. Her face was smashed. If you go to the Karnak Temple, the largest temple complex in ancient Egypt, what was called the eighth pylon, or what is called the eighth pylon, was once the pylon of Hatshepsut, but it was taken over by Amenhotep II, and he replaced himself with where she was, where her name was. We have others, examples such as at this Montu temple in North Karnak as well, where Hatshepsut was erased and the name of Amenhotep II was put over it. We have an interesting stele, a monument that now shows Amenhotep II, but previously the name Hatshepsut was on it and his was put over the top of that. And there are numerous other examples known. So why would he do this? Why would he do this to someone he had never met? The idea that just because she was a female pharaoh doesn't make sense. There were other female pharaohs in Egyptian history, and the same type of campaigns were not done against them. Furthermore, his father could have done all this and could have done away with her administrators and retaliated against her administration, but he didn't do that. So there had to be some external motivation. And if she then is blamed for what happened with the Exodus because she saved Moses, then it makes sense why Amenhotep II might have retaliated against her. We also have something happening at one of the Exodus cities, the city of Ramses or Avaris. There was a palace, actually I should say it was really a royal district of the city that was occupied there through the 18th dynasty, especially during the time of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. But during the reign of Amenhotep II, it was abandoned. Why was it abandoned? We don't know exactly why. The excavators proposed some type of plague. They're not thinking of the Exodus plagues, but some extreme event. It was abandoned. Why was that? Well, if the Exodus and the plagues occurred during his reign, that may have been reason to pack up and leave that area. We also see an abandonment of Semites who would have been slaves at the time at the city of Pithom, located at Tel El Rataba. Very recent excavations there found that it was occupied into the reign of Amenhotep II, and then there was a large abandonment for over a century. We see slave labor throughout this period as well, so we know that people like the Israelites were being enslaved and were forced to make bricks, like Exodus 5 tells us. This Pharaoh also fits the psychological profile of the Pharaoh in the Exodus. Now, by itself, this is not convincing, but it certainly adds to all the circumstantial evidence. He seems to have depicted himself as superhuman and also quite violent and cruel. And we see his stubbornness as well. Many attributes that we might say maybe he was compensating for something. Claim things like being able to shoot 4 arrows at a time through a copper target, a palm thick. Basically impossible. Even Robin Hood couldn't do things like this. He was once rowing with a team of 200 Egyptian sailors. They all got exhausted, but he kept rowing the ship by himself. He talks about some of his battles where he single-handedly killed these 7 prince warriors, like he didn't really need his army. I highly doubt, however, that he was at the head of the army. He was probably in the back watching. We also see on something called the Western Karnak stele, a very strange order where he requests to destroy all the images of the gods, including the chief god at the time, Amun-Ra, perhaps in anger for something that had happened. And as we read Exodus, we see this hardening of the heart by the Exodus Pharaoh. And it makes sense that Amenhotep II could be someone who would do that. By the way that this is described in Exodus and the way that the Egyptians thought of things, I think is very insightful as well. Because in the Bible, we have two different descriptions. There is making his heart heavy, and then there is strengthening his heart. Now, in the Egyptian theological context, if Moses is saying that he is making his heart heavy, it sounds like he's saying you're sinning against God. His heart would get heavy with sin. And in order to get into paradise for Egyptians, your heart could not outweigh the feather of Ma'at on these scales. And so the Pharaoh would have understand perfectly what is going on here, that he is sinning against Yahweh. And yet some of that gets a little bit lost in translation. So what else happened during his reign or just after the time of the Exodus? There was a decline in the military. Very commonly, the pharaohs would go out to war. His father was one of the most successful military commanders. We know of 17 campaigns that he conducted, really extended Egypt's influence the farthest that they ever had, to the Euphrates in the northeast, down to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south. And yet, Amenhotep II didn't do much. He had an early military campaign, and then he had a post-Exodus campaign that we will look at in just a minute. Well, if we look through the records of Egypt, we really don't see major campaigns for about the next century. And if you read what's called the Amarna letters, there are all these requests from Canaanite kings back to the Pharaoh to send troops against the Habiru who are taking over the land. And yet those Egyptian troops are never sent. Why? Why would they not do that? Was he just unwilling or was he unable? It was really in Egypt's best interest to keep control of Canaan so they could have it as a buffer zone and also tributes, but they seem to have been unable to send any troops. Well, this may also be illuminated by this post-Exodus campaign, which was really more of a slave raid by Amenhotep II. And he claims, if we add up all the totals, that he took 101,128 prisoners back to Egypt, so replenishing your lost slave force. He also says that they got 1,032 chariots and 13,050 weapons of warfare. So there are your chariots back, there are your weapons back. Now all you need is men. That might take a little bit longer to replenish, but at least they got their slaves, their weapons, and their chariots back. At least that's what he would lead you to believe. But in general, in fact, I don't know of any scholar who thinks that these numbers are legitimate. They think that he is drastically embellishing, that this is propaganda in order to make himself look better. But certainly if his army, his chariots had been destroyed in the Reed Sea, he would want to make it look like he resupplied Egypt and he was in control once again. And of course, that loss of control is displayed very well in the narrative about the plagues. In Exodus, we read that against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. And then we also read in Numbers 33:4, Yahweh had also executed judgments on their gods. So, future, past. He's going to, he did. And that's what we see in the text, of course. But we also see that in an Egyptian poem, there may be a memory of these plagues as well. This is called the Dialogue of Ipuwer and the Lord of All. And he primarily is giving a lament and some angry questions about where in the world are the gods and what is the Pharaoh doing? while Egypt is being destroyed, all this death and destruction. If you want to read more about that, I also have done an article on this that goes into depth more. But it's interesting that the author's name, Ippur, actually appears in a text of this time period just prior to the Exodus. We don't know if he lived on into the reign of Amenhotep II or not. We just have very limited data, but he was probably around during that time. We also see on the mummy of Amenhotep II something very strange. Now, this is speculative, but you will notice his skin is covered in what is described as tubercles. And I have read things like the family during the 18th dynasty, the royal family had these genetic issues, and certainly they did from incest. But I have not been able to find other members of the family who have these same issues. There were other problems that we see later on, like with Akhenaten and Tut. But this is something that's worth looking into more. Could this be left over from the boils or some other plague? Possibly, but that's an open question. However, when we get to the final plague, the death of the firstborn, I think we have two different types of archaeological evidence that's quite compelling, situating the Exodus in the reign of Amenhotep II. The first, which is more well-known, would be the dream stele of Thutmose IV. Now, this is sitting in between the paws of the Sphinx. It's still there today. It's huge. They're not going to move it, although you can't go down there normally anymore without special permission. But it narrates this very strange interaction between Thutmose IV before he is Pharaoh and this god of the Sphinx. And he talks about how he had been out hunting. In the afternoon, he lays down, he takes a nap, and the god of the Sphinx comes to him in a dream and basically makes a deal. Clear the sand away, I'm going to make you Pharaoh. Okay, so I guess he does that, and he becomes Pharaoh. And so the gods had planned for him to become Pharaoh all along. Why would he need to put together this piece of divine propaganda? It's because his brother, his older brother, had died, and he had not been the crown prince. And so he wanted to make sure everybody knew that the gods had planned all along for him to become the next Pharaoh. They're in control. Things are fine. You can trust in him. And in fact, his older brother did die. This is not contested at all. The question is, what happened to his older brother, and who was this? So, by the way, Amenhotep II, who I would say is the Exodus Pharaoh, also was not the firstborn. His older brother, Amenemhat, died much earlier, probably 30 plus years before the Exodus. So, if the firstborn dies, the Pharaoh can't be the firstborn either, and he was not. But what about his son? This is one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of this whole study here, is that when the tomb of Amenhotep II was discovered in the Valley of the Kings, call it Tomb 35, KV 35, there was a cache of mummies discovered in there in addition to the king. So Amenhotep II was in his sarcophagus, which is actually fairly rare, but there were other mummies that had been stashed in there in the late period of ancient Egypt for safekeeping. But one in particular is especially important because it was this mummy of a boy, maybe 8-10 years old. And you can see by his hairstyle that he was a prince. And inside the tomb were inscriptions identifying, naming one of Amenhotep's sons. His son's name was Weben-Senu. We have his what's called shabtis, these little statuettes that they thought would help in the afterlife, and also his canopic jars inscribed with his name on it. So why in the world was this young boy, this young prince of Egypt, interred in the cave, the tomb of the Pharaoh? He would have been put in there earlier, presumably, before Amenhotep was buried, because then the tomb would have been sealed. Unless, of course, this is from much, much later, and he has nothing to do with that family. DNA test is needed to confirm, but we have the inscriptions in there. So we know that this is the son of Amenhotep II from other inscriptions naming him as the king's son. Now, if he's 8 years old, say, how does this work? And why would I say this indicates that he died around the time of the Exodus? Amenhotep II became king when he was 18 years old. And if his son dies about 4 years later at 8 years old, then he probably would have had this son around age 14, which is about when they started to get married and have children for many of the pharaohs. Now, if you take a co-regency for Amenhotep II, which some do, that might push it back a couple years and he'd be a little bit older. But it fits very well with being the first child that he had. And as far as I could tell, there is no parallel like this in the Valley of the Kings. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find a prince buried in the same tomb or burial chamber as his father, the Pharaoh, anywhere in ancient Egypt. So something strange is going on here, noteworthy. So we've looked at all sorts of circumstantial evidence, which maybe each in isolation isn't all that convincing, but together starts to pile up. But there's one more thing to look at, and that is, what do Egyptian records say about the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And the one source we have is from a bit later in Egyptian history, but nonetheless, it is an ancient Egyptian source. This is Manetho. Manetho lived during the 4th and 3rd century BC. He was a priest of Heliopolis. He was a historian. He had access to all sorts of records that we no longer have access to, as well as being, of course, fluent in his native Egyptian. He could read these things so much faster and better than anyone today could. And unfortunately, although he wrote some very important works, we only have snippets of it preserved in some classical period writings. But first, I'll point out that Manetho did, in fact, discuss an exodus of the Israelites. And just one line I'll highlight here. They went away with their whole families and effects, took their journey from Egypt through the wilderness for Syria. They built a city in that country, which is now called Judea, and called it Jerusalem. So even though he doesn't say the Hebrews, the Israelites, we know it's them because of Judea, of Jerusalem. But to our specific topic of the Pharaoh, he also says something about this. He talks about this exodus and says they went out of that country afterwards and settled in that country, which is now called Judea, and there built Jerusalem and its temple. And then Josephus, which this is preserved in, he's reading through Manetho, and he sees this comment about the name of the Exodus Pharaoh. And this is Josephus's comment on it. He says, he mentions Amenophis, a fictitious king's name. So Josephus doesn't know this king's name, and he actually thinks that Manetho is just making it up. Amenophis, by the way, is the Greek version of Amenhotep. So Manetho tells us that Amenhotep was the name of the Pharaoh during the Exodus, at least according to his records. And to me, that seals all the rest of it and puts it together. And in summary, we have the chronology just lining up. We have the previous Pharaoh, Thutmose III, who ruled for more than 40 years. We have his great aunt, Hatshepsut, who would have saved Moses from the Nile, and his retaliation campaign against her. We have storage facilities built. We have the abandonment of the Nile Delta Palace during the reign of Amenhotep II. His psychological profile certainly fits. He even had statues of the gods destroyed, which may have been due to his anger at what he saw as the gods abandoning Egypt. The Ippur papyrus might be placed right around this time as well, perhaps a poetic, unofficial Egyptian version of the plagues. The decline of the military, this post-Exodus campaign where he says he got back all these slaves, and he got chariots, and he got weapons. We have the next Pharaoh is not the firstborn, and he has a divine appeal to make it all look like it's planned. We have the young son of Pharaoh, the prince, buried in Amenhotep II's tomb, Weben Senu. And we then even have Manetho saying that the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Amenhotep II. So I hope that even though that's a lot of names and a lot of information, that you can see not just the circumstantial evidence, but some of the events and even name seem to be corroborated from the biblical text into ancient Egyptian history and archaeology. And so, although we don't have a text from the time of Moses that says the name of the Pharaoh is Amenhotep II, I think we can be fairly confident at this point that's who it was. And that's the bigger answer here, is that yes, we do have much archaeological evidence demonstrating the historical reliability of Exodus and these important events in the Bible. Thank you.
Okay, we do have some time for questions. So raise your hand if you have a question. I can bring the microphone to you.
Did you say that Amenhotep II was the son of the dude the third?
Yeah, he was the son of Thutmose III. He was the second-born son of Thutmose III.
So how's he the second if he's the son? Like it seems like the second is a junior, but he's not a junior.
His older brother died.
So they just call him the second because he's the second son?
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. Yes. So there are 4 pharaohs named Amenhotep in the 18th dynasty. So we number them in order to differentiate.
Okay. Okay, like the popes. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Do we know who the pharaoh was during Joseph's time?
I would say no. People have some guesses, some good guesses, but it's a more difficult issue because people can't even agree on the time of Joseph exactly. And it's also a period of Egyptian history that's much more murky than this 18th dynasty. So hopefully sometime in the future we'll get some sort of inscription, clear evidence, and pinpoint that.
So do you have a guess at all? I mean, are there any names out there?
My preference for it, at least the long-running pharaoh that he serves under, because he serves under more than one, is a pharaoh called Sheshi.
Okay. Thank you.
How did you become interested in researching archaeology?
All the way back into elementary school, liked history, got introduced to archaeology through a book I was given and visiting actually a Hawaiian archaeological site. And then was given some more books, this time on biblical archaeology in junior high, and that sort of opened it up for me. And eventually I decided I wanted to try to study it. Didn't know if it would go anywhere, but I thought it was very interesting. It could be a useful subject. And I was able to start working on digs and get various degrees and jobs, and finally turned it into a career.
I have a question. I kind of got lost with all the names, but Amenhotep II was the younger brother of the one that died during the 10 plagues, or he was the pharaoh?
Thutmose IV, yeah, was a younger brother.
Okay.
Yes. His
Okay.
older brother died and disappeared. In fact, he seems to have rubbed his brother's image off of one of his monuments as well. But the Egyptians themselves don't tell us, or at least we don't have any remaining evidence of their account of what happened.
And has anything useful been found at the bottom of the Red Sea?
No, well, it's the Reed Sea, so it's not the Red Sea, but we don't know exactly where they crossed, but all that whole area was torn up by the Suez Canal. And if someone did happen to locate the right place, it would be quite difficult still to find anything. The chariots were mostly composed of wood. There were some metallic components. Maybe some of the weapons would survive, but there's going to be a corrosion factor as well. I think we could find something, but you have to dig in exactly the right place. So that's the difficulty.
Thanks.
I know there's a chronology question related to 430 years, and some like to divide it in half and have a 215 year. Do you take a position on that?
Yeah, my position on that is that the textual variant in Exodus 12:40, which is either the sons of Israel were in Egypt or they were in Canaan and Egypt for 430 years. I take the Canaan and Egypt one. And part of the reason is because of Galatians, where Paul says that from the promise to Abraham to the law was 430 years. And so that doesn't really give us enough time. Well, it doesn't work with Joseph being the 430 years. And there's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in one manuscript where we do have part of that verse preserved, even though the section we want to see is missing, based on reconstruction of the length of the line, it seems like it would be Egypt and Canaan together.
Are you still involved in archaeological digs? Or are you mostly doing the academic teaching and?
Yeah, I'm still involved every year. I do excavations. So this year I was digging at Zoar, southwest or southeast side of the Dead Sea. So I'll continue doing things like that every year until it doesn't work for some reason.
Why the Reed Sea instead of the Red Sea?
It is called the Yam Suf in Hebrew, which means Reed Sea. And that was actually an Egyptian word that they borrowed there. So they're talking about a body of water that has reeds all around it, which seems to indicate that it's fresh water, not the salty Red Sea.
Other questions? Yeah.
How do most of these digs get paid for?
Donations.
Okay, and the
Yeah,
reason,
usually private donors. That's what it all comes down to.
Okay.
Because even if it's being funded by a university, it's actually being funded by people who donated to the university for that specific purpose.
okay,
They just don't have that in their budgets. And museums rarely do excavations anymore because they also have to get the donations and they don't get the artifacts anymore either. So yeah, people have to want to have new things discovered. And so somebody's got to come up with the funding.
Titus, have you ever found an artifact yourself? I mean, something really exciting to you personally?
Yeah, quite a few things. I was talking earlier about, I think coins are a great teaching tool, and those are some of my favorite finds. Digging in Jerusalem, for example, and we find coins that say King Herod on them, or another one that says King Agrippa. And these, of course, were people in the New Testament who are named specifically and have interactions with Jesus or the apostles. And so those are some of my favorites. But other things like digging up a destruction layer from the time of Joshua or a Canaanite altar, and there are all sorts of very, very intriguing things. It can be really exciting even when you find something that isn't necessarily historically significant, because the reality is that 98% of the time that you're excavating, you're just digging dirt and maybe some broken pieces of pottery. But the more interesting finds are quite rare.
Okay, last question. Oh, and then I have one too.
How is it the Egyptians documented their history?
You mean it on what medium did
Yeah,
they record
right,
it?
right. And how likely were they to report negative history?
So papyrus for a lot of documents, but they inscribed things on stone, obviously, official type of monuments. Some things were on wood. They also wrote on shards of pottery occasionally, or so lots of different ways. But the papyrus isn't preserved in many different areas. The climactic conditions need to be just right. So like the Nile Delta region, which is primarily where the Israelites were living, that does not have good conditions for the preservation of papyrus. So what do we have from up there? Mostly stone inscriptions. In the south, it's different. There's a lot more papyri. But as far as would they record something like this, no, we would never expect them to. In fact, almost no culture of the ancient Near East would record their losses or embarrassments. When we do see rare situations of them talking about a battle or an event where they didn't win, the way that they frame it is like it's a draw or they just decided to leave or something like that. So they're not going to say that their country was thrown into mayhem and that a group of slaves was able to escape them because their God was more powerful than all the gods of Egypt.
Right. So my question, years ago, at Spokane Bible Church, you presented a paper on the large numbers in numbers. Have you expanded upon that or done more with that in recent years?
I have done a bit more on it. I just haven't finished the article because I've been so busy with other things. But some of the additional portions I've looked at are things like that campaign stele that I mentioned, where Amenhotep II says he went and took all these prisoners from Canaan, and it adds up to 101,000. Manetho or Josephus records a similar number, a little less, more like about 80,000. And so there's some other records in there outside of the Bible, as well as one in the Bible, in the book of Numbers, where we have the number of firstborn males from every tribe except for Levi as 22,073. So there's some indications that it was a lot smaller than an extrapolated, whatever, 2.5, 4 million, depends on who you talk to, based on family size, really.
Okay, thank you. Last one.
Last one. It's really short. Have you ever hosted any educational events or been a guide at excavation sites for interested parties?
I have done guiding and touring to various sites, and I've given people maybe 30-minute, hour or something overview of a site that I've been excavating at. But usually I'm either doing a tour of a whole region separately, or I'm just working at a site.
Were you part of the Drive Through the Bible project there with the Discovery?
Drive through history.
Okay, I'm thinking of something else.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you, Titus.
Thank you.
All right, well, this concludes our second night. We will be back bright and early tomorrow morning, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So first speaker is at 9 o'clock, and that's going to be where Buzz, you're our first speaker. All right, good deal. So yeah, we got another a great lineup tomorrow with 2 before lunch, 2 after lunch. I'm still taking it by faith that Stan Newton will be here. I just haven't heard yet. Tommy and Janice Ice are with us tonight, and Tommy, of course, is our keynote speaker tomorrow night, so we're excited about that. Let me close with prayer, and then we can go. We can sleep fast and be back first thing in the morning. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for yesterday and today and all these blessings you're pouring forth upon us. We give you the praise and glory, Father, for all that you have done, all that you continue to do, and all that you intend to do till the trumpet sounds and you bring us home. We thank you, Father, and we praise you in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Austin Bible Church is a grace ministry. No price is ever assigned to any video, audio, printed material, or anything provided by this ministry. Costs associated with such grace provision are paid in full by grace-oriented born-again believers in Jesus Christ, motivated by God the Holy Spirit, well-pleasing to God the Father. More information on our grace-giving policy and your opportunity to join in this Grace Financial Fellowship can be found at the link in the description below.